Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jake Hirsch Allen, and I'm a director on the board of the Canadian Club of Toronto. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land itself, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We're grateful for the opportunity to be able to come together to learn on this land. Today, we're joined by Canada's Minister of Labour, the Honourable Seamus O'Regan, for a conversation about the government's plan to support workplace mental health, strengthen Canada's social safety net, and position the country for a strong post-pandemic recovery. The Minister will be joined in conversation by Club President David Simmonds. Before we hear from today's speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping instructions. Please take note of the following. The click here switch stream button at the bottom helps if your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality should remain strong. Again, if you click the click here to switch stream button. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they will be sent to the moderator. The request help button located in the bottom right corner of the page is for technical support. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for helping to make this event possible. Thanks to the generous support of Bruce Power, Canadian Bankers Association, and LifeWorks, today's event is free of charge. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we've been gathering people together for 125 years. It's because of our sponsors, partners, and members like you that we're able to do so. Thank you for your continued support. One of the club's traditions that has not changed in this virtual world is the toast we make to our country. If you have a drink nearby, please join me in a toast. To Canada.
To Canada.
Now we'd like to turn the podium over to Stephen Liptrap, President and CEO of LifeWorks, to introduce the Honourable Seamus O'Regan.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to thank the Canadian Club of Toronto for the opportunity to introduce the Honourable Seamus O'Regan. Minister O'Regan will be speaking today on the important topics related to his current portfolio as Minister of Labour, including the pressing need to support the mental health and well-being of Canadians in the workplace, which is core of what we do at our company, LifeWorks. Let me say up front, Minister, that given your years of experience and success in other portfolios in service to Canadians, we look forward to your leadership in providing support to all Canadians who have struggled through a challenging period with their mental health and well-being. As many of you are aware, Minister O'Regan came to his new portfolio with years of experience in mental health and well-being field. At Veteran Affairs, he helped to ensure Canadians who served and their families were supported in the well-being area. At Natural Resources, he and his team were in constant communication with many thousands of Canadians whose livelihood were impacted by the uncertainty in that market. Prior to entering politics, the minister was a journalist, and he's been very open about his own mental health experiences and what he has done to ensure his own well-being, serving as an inspiration to many. Minister, I can't think of another time in recent memory where the mental health of Canadian workers will potentially have such a strategic bearing on how the economy recovers from the challenges of the past 2 years. At LifeWorks, our monthly mental health index has been tracking the steep decline in the mental health of Canadian workers and workers around the world since COVID entered our lives. It's clearly a difficult situation, particularly given the well-known relationship between a person's well-being and their performance at work. At the same time, LifeWorks has been called on by our clients across the country, including governments, to provide mental health support to millions of workers in many sectors of the economy, including those in the underserved and vulnerable population. It's been a challenging time, but also rewarding, knowing that by improving lives, we're also improving business. Minister, I'm particularly excited by the opportunity provided today by the Canadian Club to broaden the discussion around mental health in the Canadian workplace. But as we know, it takes more than talk. As important as talk is, it's time for us to pull together in common cause towards shared goals and coordinated action. Minister, I believe that we have the creativity, that we have the lived experience, and we have the perspective here to establish Canada as a premier provider of the mental health and well-being services in and to the world. Your mandate letter as Minister of Labour contains objectives that are very much front of mind for those of us in the mental health field, ensuring the financial security through paid sick leave and reskilling workers to maintain our global competitiveness. The right to disconnect legislation to help persevere the concept of a work-life separation, which has become invaluable due to the increased or perceived expectations to be responsive at all hours and unchecked presenteeism. And most importantly, amending the labor code to include workplace mental health. There are many ways you can help the situation, and we look forward to working with you today and for tomorrow. In an ever more competitive and stressful world, we need to ensure everyone, all Canadians, have access to the services they need to be healthy, happy, and productive. It's an opportunity with the potential to have profound benefits to all Canadians and their families and to our country as a whole. Please join me in welcoming David Simmonds, who will host our conversation today with Minister O'Regan. David is the Global Chief Communications and Sustainability Officer for Great-West Lifeco and Canada Life. He is also president of the Canadian Club Toronto, who will host our conversation today with Minister O'Regan. David, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for your continued support of the club as podium. Minister O'Regan, welcome to the Canadian Club. You're joining us from down home. We appreciate having you here. I wish we were together in Toronto. It's been a long time, but very happy to have you at the podium.
Thanks a lot, David. And thank you, Stephen, for the kind words. I am indeed in St. John's, which is the traditional territory of the BFUC. We were talking about how we would do this and, the offer kindly from the Canadian Club. Can I just say, too, the Canadian Club, I have written speeches for this before, but I have not actually given speeches to the Canadian Club. I used to work as a policy advisor to Brian Tobin. I used to write his speeches, and he'd given a couple of addresses to the Canadian Club. So it is a particular thrill for me to appear before the Canadian Club myself, and in my own words. But I think we're all used to Zoom, too used to it. And frankly, in my experience, I don't know many people watching, but speeches aren't good on Zoom. It just doesn't. So anyway, I'm going to say a few words, but what David and I agreed to was more of a Q&A, more of an interview. I'd rather open it up and have more time to field questions from your members and from people who are joining. So as I usually tend to do, kind of, dive right in. I think the whole world has been contending with this, what seems to be one crisis after another over these past 2 years. The good news in terms of the pandemic is that almost 80% of Canadians now are fully vaccinated. And that number is actually over 90% here in my home province, Newfoundland and Labrador. We've seen the images from downtown Ottawa these past few days. And I want to talk about that briefly because, getting back to what some of the comments Stephen was making, all of this is completely unnerving. Watching it all unfold. I could get into the logistics and into other things, but just talking about mental health, I mean, this takes a toll. I mean, people saying constant hateful things, but let me just remind everybody, they may be loud, but they are few. They are grossly outnumbered by Canadians who care about one another and who have shown up for one another. Those expressing hate are dwarfed by the actions of tens of millions of people who've come together, who've gotten vaccinated, who socially distance, who wear masks. We had an election. And I know some people say it didn't change anything, the election that we had in September, but the context in which we held that election was completely changed. We were in a pandemic. So while the seat number may have ended up the same, the bottom line is that millions of people used their vote and they voted for science. And they voted for kindness. They voted for care. And listen, millions of people every day continue to make sacrifices for each other. And they do it to save lives. Millions of people, including us. None of us has asked for this pandemic. 90% of us have found a way to pull together and to navigate it without hurting people or shutting down a couple of city blocks. But, I would be remiss if I didn't say that this has been harder on some than others. There are some people in our communities who have a harder time of it than others and who are carrying immense burdens. And we got to keep an eye on them. And if I was going to single out any group right now, I'd have to single out our healthcare workers amongst them, that group. I think the burden that they are undertaking is incredible. It is just incredible. So we need to turn our attention and I think our collective ability to care to these groups that are vulnerable. We are experiencing a mental health crisis. Half of Canadians said that their mental health has worsened in the past 2 years. Half. And I know I'm preaching with the choir here, obviously, but that's half of the people right here, right now. C'est une crise majeure, mais c'est surtout une crise parce que notre société a décidé pendant plusieurs années de ne pas traiter cette question comme un vrai problème de santé. Les Canadiens connaissent mieux leurs droits en milieu de travail et ils savent que leur premier droit fondamental est un environnement sain et sécuritaire. C'est pas seulement une question de droit ou de justice, c'est aussi une question d'affaires, une question économique. Une économie forte demande de personnel en santé. Et la santé mentale est fait partie. Chaque semaine, 500 000 de Canadiens sont absents de travail en raison d'un problème de santé mentale. Et les travailleurs sont des humains. Et parfois, ils font face à des moments difficiles et complexes. We're all suffering. So, look, I want to try and help close the gap for workers as Minister of Labour, while at the same time making sure that our economy remains competitive and prosperous. So, I'm looking forward to talking about that today. And as we emerge from the pandemic, I think we need to take a hard look at things that we've done in the past and see how we can do them going forward. And I would say one of the things that, David, if it comes up later, I'm maybe passing a hint here, but I'm in your capable hands. But one of the things I've dealt with in this role and dealt with in my previous role as Minister of Natural Resources, as Stephen pointed out, in a time of great uncertainty for, our biggest sector of our economy, particularly our oil and gas sector, Canada being the fourth biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, were the hundreds of thousands of workers whose lives were turned upside down by a global price war on top of a pandemic. So dealing with the energy transition that we are seeing around the world, and I would argue that Canada has the ability to lead, causes an awful lot of anxiety amongst hundreds of thousands of energy workers across the country. And that is a big passion of mine. And in fact, that transition, which some people call just transition, which is a phrase most of us don't like. But anyway, that's something that the Prime Minister has tasked me with in my role too as Minister of Labour. Anyway, enough chat from me. I made a promise we'd open it up to questions and to you, David, so I look forward to it.
Thank you, Minister O'Regan. Do you mind if I call you Seamus?
Yes. No, I do not mind. But yes, okay, please do,
right,
David.
Minister.
Yes.
We'll get to questions. I appreciate your opening remarks and the comments that you made. I think they're really important. And at a time when Canadians are distant, doing our part, reminding that we are moving towards a space where we'll hopefully be able to get together in the near term and stick together in the near term is super important. As you talk about the pandemic, perhaps maybe you've talked about the macro issues around the pandemic. You've talked about how it's influenced your thinking as minister. You've reflected on the Prime Minister's thinking and the mandates he's given you all as cabinet members. As a person, as a partner and as a community member, maybe just reflect a little bit with our audience about how it might be influencing you in general, in the way that you're just approaching daily life. Because I'm finding that it's changed the way I think about daily life more and more.
Yeah, that is a really good question, David. Well, I mean, just a bit of background. Stephen alluded to it. I did not deal with change well. I did not deal with transition well. I came, from a media background. I was, co-host of Canada AM for 10 years, and the media world is going through an incredible amount of transition, and not to make light of it, and I didn't mean to make light of it, but one of the first speeches I gave as a member of Parliament some 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, was here in St. John's, and it was to the Unifor Media division. They were meeting nationally, and there were some people in the crowd I'd worked with at CTV who were in that crowd, and they were interested in hearing from me and my decision to leave media and to go into politics. And I looked at them with a straight face and said, I decided to go into politics for the stability. And that they had the same reaction you just did, David, which was, an initial laugh, and then their faces darkened because they knew I was right.
Yeah.
It is extremely tumultuous. I mean, there are, everybody's feeling some form of instability, but it's particularly hard. And it led me to drink a lot, way too much. I ended up with a drinking problem and becoming severely depressed. It's hard to tell, and honestly, I spent a lot of time in rehab and still go to therapy, and it's hard to tell when alcoholism begins and depression ends, or it's a vicious cycle. But what I learned, and I'll pass on to everybody, is you got three things. You got genetics. I am, as you can probably, as my name belies, kind of Irish. You got your environment, and here in Newfoundland, we drink. It's more open. I mean, I lived in Toronto for a long time. People drink in Toronto, people drink in Ottawa, but here it's more accepted at maybe different times a day, and it's more socially acceptable to have maybe one more. And you add on top of that stress, and that's what did it for me. That threw me over the edge. And I think, for me, the most important thing, and I say this to anybody who's like, oh, I wonder if I'm having, we have to really kind of expunge the morality play around it, right? It is a mental health issue. It is very closely associated with depression. And I only know from myself and having, how I dealt with it. It wasn't easy in the beginning. But thank God I've got a great family and great friends, and they more or less kind of gathered around, coordinated over the distances, and said, "You got to do this. You really have to do this. This isn't good." And so I went for the whole month. The Christmas, my first Christmas, so Christmas 2015, 2016, went for 5 weeks, and I've been good. I've been good ever since. And I think the nice thing about sometimes with a vicious circle, or it can turn into a virtuous one. Once you get healthy and you're that productive and you're that much better, you do not want to go back. You do not want to go back. So there are variations and degrees of this. My experience is my experience, and I share it for what it's worth. And it's different for many, many other people. So, all of this for some people, it could trigger it again. Just this much instability again, this much pressure and stress and strain. And it has led more people to drink, for instance, and it has led to greater increases of depression and anxiety. And all of that makes total sense, doesn't it? It does make total sense. So to come around to answer your question by way of a lot of background, routine is a great help. As long as you don't become enslaved to it, such that if you kind of buck the routine, it gives you increased anxiety. That's something I have to watch out for. But routine does help. Sleep helps. Sleep is a huge issue. And I just notice, the amount of people who talk about sleep, the articles and books that are written about it, I think people have cottoned on to how important sleep is and your physical health. Like I work out, and I work out not to fit in my suits, although that's one reason. It's for this.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference. I can feel it if I don't find the time to work out on any day, and I make time for it. It's easier to make time for it when you're not traveling as much as I used to and look forward to again. So you have to take the time. And I would say, I know there's a lot of busy people who are watching. If you're not already doing this, take a hold of your schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Like rule it and stick to it, and make sure other people respect it. So some handy tips from a bit of experience.
That's so important. Seamus, I'll remind the audience they can submit questions using the submit question button at the bottom of their screen. The questions I'm getting from the audience right now are not questions. They're applause and thanks for your continued vulnerability around the journey around wellness and the journey around self-care and your journey. I remember watching with many Canadians when you communicated your decision to take care and to invest in self-care so you can come back and serve the people of Newfoundland and of Canada. So thank you for that.
Let me just say, I'll add to this just as a point too. Initially it feels brave because it just feels so daunting, and you don't know how people are going to judge you or look upon you. You worry that that is how you will be looked upon for the rest of your life. An alcoholic, somebody who has depression. And I'm very happy to say that the times we live in, I'm not saying the bias isn't there, the stigma isn't there, it is, but it's a lot less than it used to be. And, I thank people for applauding, because what it says to me is that the milieu and the time that we live in has changed demonstrably. That is not how people reacted only 10, 15, 20 years ago. So thank you for that. And let me also say, talking about it openly is actually incredibly affirming, and it's a lot less anxious, trust me, than being closeted about it. Having it out there just kind of gets it out of the way, and then, you can get on and talk about other things. But, it was particularly germane to this conversation, and that's why I wanted to spend a little more time on it than I usually do.
For sure. Minister, earlier today, you had struck an advisory council or advisory committee.
Yes, breaking news. This just in, David. Yes.
And breaking news at the Canadian Club.
Yes.
We learned a lot of new words this year, Minister. We learned words and phrases. We learned the Greek alphabet this year. And we've been hearing a lot about the future of work. We've been hearing a lot about the Great Recession. We've been hearing a lot about the she-session and how this dynamic has impacted, women and caregivers and trying to engage in work from home and virtual work and whatnot. But it's also has amplified the ability to connect, right? In 3-4 years ago, you'd be on a plane to Toronto to be with me at the Canadian Club to have this conversation. Today, you're in Newfoundland. And so one of the things in this report is the right to disconnect, this new phrase that we're hearing spoken around by policymakers, by business leaders, by employees, by labor. Talk to me a little bit about your first impressions. You just got the recommendations today, so I'm not going to put you on the spot and talk about implementation. No. But your first impressions on the report, what does what does that right to disconnect mean? What do Canadians need to know? What are your first impressions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, David, I'll let you in on a couple of things. First of all, I learned a new phrase today, and it may well be because as I learn these phrases, where I sit in government, then, they become part of the vernacular within no time at all, as you said, with the Greek alphabet. So the new phrase that I've learned, or the new word that I've learned, is interpandemic. We are in interpandemic time. So between variants, between So this is interpandemic. My friend Dominic LeBlanc, who's one of the quickest wits I know, said it sounds like a hotel that offers Bonvoy points. Are you staying at the interpandemic? Yeah. So yes, this just in. So, on the right to disconnect. First of all, a bit of background. I think that anybody who's watching right now gets it. And I think it became particularly poignant when a lot of us anyway, started working from home. And the expectation, therefore, was on people to always be able to answer whenever their boss or their colleague or their client wanted them to answer. And this is really difficult. Look, a lot of us are type A personalities. We don't like saying no. We don't like being out of the loop. We don't like putting down the phone. And yet, you do have to find time to do it. And I'd be the first one to admit, in the times when I have said, I'm putting the phone away and I'm taking a few days off, it has given me more anxiety, frankly, than if I had it. So it's like anything else. You have to learn how to moderate it, and you have to learn when to shut it off. And as I said, make sure that other people are respectful of your time. There are some of us, who are in better positions to do that than others. Okay, I'm a cabinet minister. I have people who work for me in my office. I have a government department. It's easier for me to be able to say, after 8 o'clock tonight, no. But even I answer to somebody, and that would be my constituents, who don't necessarily pay attention to that time, and to the Prime Minister or my cabinet colleagues, and so we're trying to make these decisions all the time. But there are some people who are much more vulnerable than others, and other countries have tried to get their heads around this. How do you? This is where government has to be really careful, and I'm always reticent. But some of this is common sense, and some of this really needs to be negotiated by every employee at their workplace, but not everybody has that opportunity, and not everybody has that position of strength or authority in which to do it. How does government come in without micromanaging? That's the bottom line. How do you make sure that you don't overreach, but at the same time protect people? Look, all I would say in the primary recommendations, and I have them, we only got them today. So this is from our Right to Disconnect Advisory Committee, and it had, representatives from federally regulated employers, unions, and other non-governmental organizations. And just to remind people, when I'm talking about those, my jurisdiction, so federal jurisdiction, which, you're talking telecommunications, you're talking banking, you're talking transportation. Immediately you think of all the big companies that are held under that umbrella, but there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that are there as well. It's roughly 5-6% of the workforce. And, unions want a robust legislative requirement for workplaces to establish an enforceable right to disconnect policy. They believe a totally voluntary policy is not going to work. Employers believe the government should not adopt a legislative or regulatory requirement related to the right to disconnect. They encourage parties to develop policies to ensure proper work-life balance for employees kind of on the ground. So, the rest of it really stems from that. Your initial approach. Do you regulate? Do you legislate? Or do you let, workplaces figure it out? They did have some joint recommendations. Some of them are, pretty easy, I would say. Look, government should facilitate the sharing of best practices. Government should improve data collection of the issue. But also, I think the other important one is any right to disconnect should be crafted in such a way to ensure that employers retain the ability to contact workers in emergency situations and to communicate critical health and safety information. I think that right there, what I would say is we have the foundation, some common sense recommendations, and we have, what you would expect from each group. But that's not to take away from what they're saying. That it's very important. Now we got to sit down together and we got to figure it out. So again, it's an advisory committee. This is what they've come to me with, and we've got to sit down at a table now and figure out where we go from here. But there's no question. It is always trying to strike that balance. You have to look out for the rights of workers. You have to ensure that we continue to have a prosperous and competitive economy. And that's my job. Figure that out.
Yeah. So, Minister, you talked about the advisory committee's advice to you, and I think that's helpful context, it's clear the tone of your remark, your comments, so you've got to find that balance, which is, I guess, the tough part of being a cabinet minister. I would sort of turn the table on you just for a second and say, as a leader,
I used to do this to people. I remember.
I know. I used to watch you do it. I still have my Canada mug at home.
It is a lot harder to have by the way, let me tell you this. It is a lot harder to have the answers than ask the questions. Yeah. I have learned this. Fair. Anyway. That's
where you're a lifelong learner. What advice do you know? So you've led 4 ministries. You worked in a high demand professional environment in journalism where you're kind of always on, right? That's the nature of being a reporter, breaking news.
At an ungodly hour.
Right. And so, given that lived experience, what advice do you have for the leaders who are joining us today around, as you negotiate and do this balance, what are some common sense, your point, thoughts that you might, volunteer to us to say, how do we be thoughtful about this? Because this is a real policy question. It's a real labor question, employment question. So what are some common sense tips, if any, that you might lend to us, given your role as a work employee in journalism and now as an executive leading government ministries on behalf of Canadians?
I think just sitting down with your employees, or as an employee sitting down with your employer as a group and discussing this would be a good start, because we don't do that on Right to Disconnect. We just don't do that at all. And, we all kind of individually go about our way. Some of us have an easier time with it than others. As I said, I get way too anxious if I'm, if this is like one of 3, unfortunately, that I have, if I'm away from them. I'm very good at putting it to one side and spending time, supper with my husband or whatever. Although, after staring at each other for about 15, 20 minutes, we both kind of go, where's the phone? I mean, but, all jokes aside, and, although that's true, sitting down with people, sitting down in your workplace and figuring this out and talking about it will be a good first step. I think that employers will find that most employees are probably like me. They're just asking for a bit of flexibility and a bit of time at home with their family without being interrupted. And then we also individually have to confront the fact that we're kind of hooked on it. And we ourselves kind of have to confront that. There's actually similarities with, just talking about this, which is something I think that 99% of people with the phone go through. And the larger issue of mental health, if, it's a big step to kind of say, okay, I got to deal with this. It's an issue. And then the important part, and I was an ambassador for Bell Let's Talk for many years as well. Before I suffered depression myself, I was an ambassador just because I felt it was extremely important. And it was something that we saw on Canada AM for years that, people were trying to deal with, and it wasn't getting enough attention. If people deal with something and have the courage to say, I have a problem and I need help on larger mental health issues, then we got to be there for them. We got to be there for them with the supports. We got to be there for them with the acceptance, because it would be all too cruel if you put people in the spotlight and then left them alone. Yeah. So that's on larger mental health issues. But the same principle applies here. If an employee wants to talk to his employer about this, the employer should be receptive and say, okay, well, let's work something out. I think that that's reasonable. As I said, we can't just rely, unfortunately, on good faith and common sense and civility. There are some very vulnerable people in our society who don't have that at their workplace. And so therefore you need some rules, and making sure that we get those rules right and don't overreach and handcuff people to policies that are, way too prescriptive. That's why I'm here. I mean, it's figuring that out. It is not easy, but in terms of what people can start doing right now, have that conversation. I mean, it's kind of common sense. And I think, if you're an employer or a boss, I think your employees will appreciate it. If you're an employee, talk to other employees and say, maybe we should have a conversation about this with the boss. And, you may find that most people, I think, are more receptive, because this is something kind of like COVID. This is something we're all going through. Mm-hmm. There aren't many Canadians who don't, know the anxiety of being disconnected, but also know the anxiety of being constantly connected. And so, we were working on some language with my communications team, and I was really excited because we landed on recharging, right? You recharge your phone, you also need to recharge yourself.
Yeah.
You need to, and we each have our own individual kind of tripwire where we go, ooh, it's too long now, I need to know what's going on. Listen, I'm not going to prescribe that for people. People will figure that out themselves. But for people who need that time, need the time with their family, need the time to disconnect, to recharge, and therefore become a more productive, and I would argue more loyal worker, let them have it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. We had the pleasure of hosting Damian Warner at a work event, the world's greatest athlete and gold medalist for Canada. And one of the things he told us is, the only reason I'm able to perform at this level is because I take the time to recharge and recover. And he was talking about physical and mental wellness in that regard. So we're hearing it from a variety of different Canadians that this is an important conversation. So I appreciate that context, and I know our audience does as well. Minister, the Prime Minister has been quite vocal and explicit around the importance of sustainability as a macro theme in this government's agenda. And if we look at your mandate letter, he has found a way to weave that in to your role as Minister of Labour. So I think I have two questions for you. The first, more broadly, how is your government, how is Cabinet seeing progress being made on sustainability, sort of on a macro Canadian perspective? And then secondly, I think, what would be your thoughts, your reflections on how we think about the impact of the sustainability agenda? You mentioned a just transition. I sort of talk about that, moving from a carbon intense to a carbon neutral economy. How are you thinking about the potential impacts of that on employees, on workers, on our economy in Canada?
Ridden with anxiety. Look, I'm, as I said, I'm in St. John's, and if I look over my shoulder here, there are windows here, by the way, but the light completely screws up the camera. But I've got one of the best views, I would argue, in the country, overlooking St. John's Harbour and overlooking the city of St. John's. We are one of 3 oil-producing provinces. We rely more on oil revenue and royalties than Alberta, which is not something that a lot of people know. So getting this right is essential to my province. It is essential to me, because it's I represent a lot of people who are in the field. When I knock on doors and when I talk to people, trust me, there's a lot of anxiety. Jobs in the oil and gas sector pay very well. But people like anybody else, they spend the money, and a lot of people enter the industry thinking, well, this is for life. So suddenly to be told about this looming kind of just transition has given people all sorts of anxiety. And what I have said is, look, workers built this industry in our country. And, I believe if you grow up on an island in the North Atlantic and in Labrador, where I did, in a very small town there, you learn to be very pragmatic. You confront the world as it is. And the fact of the matter is that Canada as a whole is the 4th biggest producer of oil and gas in the world. It is not how everybody identifies this country. Certainly in Alberta they do, and I would argue here in Newfoundland and Labrador they do, in Saskatchewan. But, I lived in Toronto for 15 years. People don't see themselves as oil producers. And yet, Iraq, Kuwait, you name them, they're in our wake. So it's a big country. I see those supply vessels go out to the rigs every day. They berth right below my office. I'm reminded of that fact every day. And what I say to my colleagues when we talk about these things is, I don't point these things out to be obstructionist. I point them out because they're there and they're a fact, and we got to deal with it. The other fact is that the planet is burning, and we got to deal with this. We got to meet our targets. So we got to achieve both, and that is not easy. So there's no magic wand. There's no flipping of a switch. This is hard work, and we've begun that. I think that some of the things that we put into place, they've been lauded around the world as being, and I've sat and spoken to the International Energy Agency almost on a monthly basis from this room. When I got Ministry of Natural Resources, by the way, I was told by my predecessors, "Oh, you're going to be in Vienna and Santiago and Paris, and flouting Canada's natural resources around the world and selling them." And I haven't left St. John's like everybody else. But anyway, but look, people look upon us as a country that has two things: an incredible amount of natural resource wealth, but also the ambition, wherewithal to do something about climate change that's meaningful. So there's a lot of eyes around the world who are watching us and how we do this. And one of the first things I did, because I became Minister of Natural Resources after the 2019 election, which was, we were shut out of Alberta, we were shut out of Saskatchewan, the Liberal Party of Canada, was immediately start talking. And in fact, a mutual friend had given the Minister of Energy in Alberta my phone number. She texted me while I was still in Rideau Hall, minutes after I'd been sworn in, before I'd actually appeared in front of the media, and said, "When are you coming to Alberta?" And I said, "How's tomorrow?" I flew out there right away. The conversation about energy transition, just transition, immediately toned down because we just started talking. And we've been working together and just trying to figure this out. I think some really important things that we've put in place are, first and foremost, a price on pollution. Like, you can't pollute for free. That's, that has the added bonus of giving the industry some clear lines and costs, and therefore more competitive. If you will be more competitive and more profitable if you take these things into account. We are capping emissions, not capping oil production, capping emissions. Okay, and there's an important difference here, because it just means that, look, oil is still very much with us, and it's going to be with us for some time, but we have to find lower emitting sources of it, and we have to find ways of producing it using much fewer emissions. And we have to be very ambitious about that. And also, we have put a significant climate plan that, even when it went through the rigor of an election campaign, you had a lot of people objectively saying, okay, they are on the right path. This is doable. This is workable. But we cannot have any illusions. And I say this to you as somebody who's living in an oil producing province in an oil producing country, is that we have to. It isn't an instant. It isn't a transformation. It is a transition. And the idea of just transition is quite loaded for a lot of people in the workforce, for the hundreds of thousands of men and women who work in the field, work in this field. And so we're trying to find language that's maybe more neutral, so that it's less loaded when you come in and you talk. Because I'm going to have a lot of conversations, and I've already had many conversations with energy workers across the country about how we do this. It has changed demonstrably, and I can tell you, in 2.5 years since I started having these chats, where it's less. I think people realize it's less loaded by politics, and actually, it's just a fact that we got to get serious about this. We got to lower emissions, but we have an opportunity to lead it. Like I said, the world is looking upon us. And what I say to workers is, look, only 2 generations and a half ago, David, we asked workers to figure out a way to get oil out of sand. And they did. Yeah. That's the job we asked them to do. Now, we understand all the ecological consequences of that much better now than we did then in the 80s and 90s. But they did their job. And here in Newfoundland, when I used to write speeches for Brian Tobin, when we got first oil from the Hibernia platform back in the late 1990s, ExxonMobil has called the offshore oil off of Newfoundland the harshest environment that they operate in the world. And yet we've done it. We've done it. And I can tell you, the last time I was flying to Ottawa, I was sitting next to Owen, a Newfoundlander in his 30s, who's on his way to Mozambique, where he'll show them how it's done. That's incredible. So how do I say to them, this is not a matter of workers being at the table. You're leading the charge. You've shown that you can do this. I need you to pivot. This country and this planet has a much bigger job for you now. You got to take what you built, and we got to figure out how we lower emissions fast, real fast. Yeah. But these are the men and women who can do it. These are the men and women who can do it. So I have faith. And it is not an unfounded faith. They did the job that we asked them to do. They built up the oil sands. They built our offshore. They created the 6th biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, 4th biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, sorry. And here we are. So big challenge ahead. We're well equipped to handle it.
Minister, I appreciate your articulation of the important role that workers, the labor movement, employees have played in facing the challenges of economic transformation in a lot of respects over the generations. There's a lot of questions coming in. I'll try to make a thematic question here for you based in that vein, of who makes up our workforce. And I tie it back to, again, reflecting on the broader agenda of the government around sustainability. Another lens of sustainability is a commitment to indigeneity in Canada. And we see that commitment as, we woven through the government's agenda. We're having a lot of questions here today around, women in the workplace, and are we really driving that agenda forward? And how do we balance that? Racialized Canadians and Black Canadians, and what does that look like? Queer identified Canadians and their rights as workers in the workplace as we move the dial forward on inclusion. How do you see the work of engaging equity seeking or equity deserving populations and our Indigenous peoples as labor minister? So I think we hear you as a Canadian. You've been articulate about that. How do you see it as labor minister in the agenda in front of you?
When you marginalize groups, you don't get the best, right? You're missing out on talent. It's that simple. And, I'm thinking of my time as natural resources minister. This is something that I said time and time again. Worked on several panels with the International Energy Agency and with the G20 on figuring out how we get marginalized groups. And I say that, I would make the argument, look, this isn't just something that is the right and proper thing to do. Economically, you are not getting the best talent when you leave people out. You're just not getting the best. By way of background, again, I grew up in Labrador. I'd spent working for the provincial government here, spent years at table with the Innu and Inuit people in Labrador, and did my master's dissertation on Indigenous inclusion and participation in natural resource development. So I have very strong feelings about this. And obviously I was Minister of Indigenous Services, as I mentioned before, too. So, a lot of, speak just briefly again on Indigenous issues, a lot of our natural resource development happens in parts of the country that aren't urban or suburban, right? They happen in places where I grew up. And those places in this country, in the generally more northern parts of our country, those are the lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And you have to include them. Like, you have to. And I would say that was a moral imperative. Now it is legal. And one of the things that we went through with them is making sure that we had a process that truly included them, because, previous governments had either kind of bulldozed their way through or whatever, and felt that they didn't need to do that. And courts were coming down with decision upon decision that just said, you can't do that. Like, you can't. It infringes upon their charter rights. You can't. So, we as a government just made the decision, well, then let's incorporate it. Let's include it. And I remember early on speaking to business groups here and in other parts of the country, where they would say more impediments to business, less competitive, impossible to get things built. I would say if we ignore Indigenous people in this country, it will be impossible to get things built. Absolutely. The courts have told us that. So look, again, pragmatic. The world as it is. This is the world. Accept it. Incorporate it. And make it competitive. And look, we went through a lot of rigor through that too, and ended up with a process that was tested by the Supreme Court and the Federal Court of Appeal, in which they said, yeah, well, you got the process right. Doesn't necessarily mean anybody's got a veto on a project. It just means that you have to go through in good faith and truly consult. Not fax a sheet of paper saying, tick off this box here to a remote Inuit community, and when they don't write back, you just assume that they're in favor. It's not going to hold anymore, And I can tell you, up until quite recently, that was done. So no, that's not going to hold water anymore. But the good news is, if you get it right, these are lasting solutions that won't be hauled into the courts again, because you got it right. You got the process right. And that's why TMX, for instance, is being built. It is being built. I know it's a very polarizing issue, but the issue of whether or not it could or could not be built, it is being built. On the matter of so many other, groups that are left out of or feel left out of the workforce, or more traditional workforces like in natural resources, there has to be a lot more work done. I agree with that. But I would say, look, we've come a long way in identifying those obstacles and knocking them down. And I am so proud, particularly, I just love posting on Twitter and other things. Whenever I see, something like Indigenous women working in forestry and working in mining. And these are high paying, technically savvy jobs. We used to look, there was a time not all that long ago, people would say hewers the wood and drawers the water like it was a bad thing. These are some of the most high tech and interesting jobs and highly paying jobs in the country. And, I'm constantly trying to think of ways, as I said, the proximity of so many of these projects to Indigenous people, particularly who live in these areas. How do we, the amount of unemployment, particularly, in First Nations communities, Inuit, Métis communities too, how do we find that way where we can attach them to a workforce shortage that we see in many of these places? How can we make that more efficient? There's a lot of, I've union leadership, I can tell you that I've spoken to in the past few months out in the prairie are very keen on working together with First Nations on this. And we could have some very interesting and rewarding things happen. To anybody out there who, by the way, thinks that, First Nations, Inuit, Métis people are anti-development, I would say that their conversations, both within their nations and amongst them, are as divergent as ours. And it would be highly patronizing to think otherwise. So some do, some don't. I mean, you've got cases, of course, where you have elected chiefs versus hereditary chiefs in the same community, talking about the same project and having very different views on it. Now, I can tell you, somebody who's spoken to the Assembly of First Nations and their annual meeting of all chiefs across the country, they are as polarized as the rest of us. But also, I think, as interested and ambitious about finding that middle way of sustainability. How are we able to take advantage of the natural resource bounty that we have in this country, doing it on our terms in an inclusive way that continues the prosperity of this country? And the fact of the matter is, there are more things that we have in common than divide us.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful observation. And Minister, we're coming close to the end of our time together. I'll ask you one last question. A lot of Canadians are, we should get you the chat somehow. A lot of Canadians are reflecting on your time as a journalist and how much they miss seeing you on Canada AM. So share that with you. Good news or good feedback for you.
Thank you.
You spent years reporting the news, and now you're making news as a cabinet minister.
I try not to make a lot of news. I'll be honest with you. I've learned that. I try and keep a low profile. But anyway,
it's probably good. Your husband probably appreciates that.
He does. In fact, my husband's greatly appreciative of that.
Yeah. Do you have any sort of final thoughts on your rest? If I reflect on the takeaways from you give us a lot to chew on. You're untying some big knots in this agenda. And I think the dialogue, the power of dialogue is a key takeaway from the stories you've told us today. In almost every situation, you've stressed the importance of conversation, dialogue, and exchange. News plays a huge role in that. Facts play a huge role in that. Journalism plays a huge role in that. Do you have any closing thoughts, given your time as a journalist and now your time as a policymaker? How should we be thinking about that moving forward? How should we be thinking about the exchange of ideas, the role of reporting, the role of facts in this conversation as we build Canada?
I'm very concerned about it. Very concerned about the polarity of discourse in the country. My colleague, Minister Pablo Rodriguez, who's the Minister of Heritage, is going to be, he's introducing legislation now, actually, that we're trying to find ways that, we can support local news and Canadian news sources across the country, so that people aren't just going to Facebook and Twitter and echo chambers. Because a lot of what I'm seeing happen right now in Ottawa and across the country are, people affirming extreme beliefs and views. There was a time, you'd be growing up in the village, I guess, and you'd think, I'm the only one who has this kind of these crazy ideas. And the rest of the community would say, no, that's just off. Like, we won't tolerate that sort of talk or behavior. But you can get online now and find thousands of people who will agree with you, and it emboldens. And now it's taken one step further, and you can organize. And that is a huge concern. The objective news sources that we need, filled with professional journalists, are on the wane. I am a casualty, I would say, of that. And it has not gotten any better. I mean, I still have lots of colleagues and friends who are in there. I mean, in fact, as many of you may know, I mean, the new member of Parliament for Toronto Centre is the Honourable Marcy Ian, my former co-host on Canada AM. You know, we're delighted to have her, and she's doing something where she said, you know, she's so well suited for the job that she's in, and she's doing good work and his job with purpose. And you know, that's important. There are so many journalists out there right now who are just, they're struggling. It doesn't pay what it used to. You aren't able to do the good work that you want to in the time that it takes because you're constantly asked to tweet and be on TikTok or whatever. You know, I mean, it's tough. The media environment is tough, but we are losing those professional voices that we need to guide us through times like this. And the ones that are there are stressed out beyond belief themselves. So we're trying to land at least on a place where we can support Canadian voices and local news in this country, produced by and voiced by professional journalists. And, you know, these are the things that you hope can make a difference. But, you know, it greatly concerns me. It occupies a lot of my time and my thought. And I'm sure that a lot of people, as we see things happen in our country that we did not think would ever happen, we're going to have to ask ourselves, once we get through this, and we will get through this, but we are going to have to ask ourselves how we arrived here and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Well, Minister, thank you for your voice. Thank you for your voice here today at our podium. We appreciate you joining us. And I appreciate the conversation. I'm going to hand it back to Jake to close this out.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you so much, David. That was an amazing conversation. And I'll say a few words about why. Thank you, Stephen Liptrap, for sponsoring us again and for sort of closing us out. But first, to the Minister, you know, thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you for sharing your government's plan on how you'll support Canadians through a post-pandemic recovery. I too continue to struggle with alcoholism and addiction, and that makes me all the more grateful for your openness today with us and for your taking a topic that can seem impersonal, particularly at the national or federal level, and bringing it down to our lives.
Jake, can I just say thank you for saying that. Like, there are people who are watching right now, and that makes a difference that you just said that. It makes a difference to me. It affirms me.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for saying that.
Of course. So more generally, the mental health of Canadians has been greatly impacted by the pandemic, as you both discussed, and as I'm sure we've all felt. And sort of it's also shifted how we work. My day job is with LinkedIn, where we've been watching these transitions in labor markets and watching how your government and you have been shepherding us through them. And we're grateful for it. To be honest, I'm proud as a Canadian who covers sort of North America to be a citizen and a resident of this country. We've also been enacting some of your recommendations, and they cover everything from how to sort of recover from mental health challenges by taking time, by talking through them as we're doing now, and ensuring at the more macro level that marginalized populations are included in an inclusive and therefore productive economy. Exactly. A productive labor market. So again, everything that you said really resonated in that respect. And thank you for leading not just Canada, but really the world in building that inclusive labor market. David, thank you again for your guidance of today's discussion. Thank you again to our sponsors, LifeWorks, Bruce Power, and Canadian Bankers Association. We appreciate your generous support of today's discussion and the fact that it's free as a result. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications, and to livemeeting.ca for making possible this gathering virtually today. We hope you'll join us for some of our upcoming events. We've got two coming up on February 15th. Please join us for a celebration of Black creativity, Black leadership, and Black agency, featuring some of Canada's most accomplished leaders. Alika Hall of the NIA Centre for the Arts, Charlene Theodore of McCarthy Tesco, and Ray Williams of National Bank Financial will be joining us for that conversation. And then on the following day, on February 16th, we'll be joined by the Honourable Sean Fraser, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, for a discussion on Canada's post-pandemic immigration strategy. To learn more about our upcoming events, explore our newly designed website, canadianclub.org, browse our rich archive of past events, and check out our new updated membership categories with enhanced benefits at a variety of levels. Please consider becoming a member to support our club's work. Guests, thank you for joining us. Please stay healthy and safe.